The biggest story coming from Normal Ireland, Gary Lineker was basically sacked from Match of the Day, although now we know that a deal has been reached. If you didn't see the tweet, here it is. There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. And I'm out of order? Now, for starters, it's ridiculous and it's right-wing cancel culture striking again that he had to step away. In a democratic society, everyone has a right to their view. I don't care if you're an insufferable rich celebrity or a liberal football pundit. It's free speech, right? The political right, of course, are up in arms about this because they are the real snowflakes who absolutely hate free speech. Rather, they operate as my speech or no speech. It's funny, though, that it took Gary Lineker criticising the governing party to face repercussions. Yet nothing from this. This is Gary Lineker making a political point about Corbyn saying bin Corbyn. Yet nothing happened. Or potentially actionable smears from Alan Sugar. Superimposing Corbyn's face on a Nazi is apparently fine, but going after those in power isn't. It's clear what this all means. The BBC is a government mouthpiece. This is Robbie Gibb, former Tory candidate and brother of Tory MP Nick Gibb. He was head of the BBC political programming up until 2017. He's also former director of Downing Street Comms for Theresa May. His job was literally to spin for the Tories, yet he had a high job in a supposedly impartial BBC. He was then appointed to the BBC's board last year by none other than Boris Johnson. Another BBC boss managed to grant an £800,000 loan to Boris Johnson. That man, millionaire Sam Blyth, and distant relative to Johnson. How cosy. There are countless Tories in the BBC, therefore attacking Jeremy Corbyn is fine, attacking Tory-like Starmer is probably fine, but not the government. Which is funny because Lineker accused Braverman of using language similar to fascism, and the Tory mouthpiece, which is the BBC, responded by punishing him. Kind of proves his point, doesn't it? Now, I think this is one of the best takes I've seen about all of this, which no one is really acknowledging. Hate to ruin it for those who think the Lineker Match Today fallout is damning for the government. But the only consequence of this in the medium to long term is that many voters will have overwhelmingly heard of an immigration policy they strongly agree with. Liberal pundits might think this will be bad for the Tories, but 50% agree with stopping the boats. So we are no closer to having a much more compassionate border policy, especially when the opposition won't oppose it either. Yes, most people in this country support nationalising rail, mail, water, energy, raising the minimum wage, all these good progressive policies. But when it comes to refugees and immigration, unfortunately, this country is incredibly reactionary. Now, what will this do? It will damage the BBC, which, for me, I'm incredibly happy about. The BBC is very right-wing. It's Fox News and a bit more sensible clothing. It's lost any semblance of impartiality and is a national disgrace. Remember this?
Hello, Prime Minister. I'd just like to ask you, how important is it for someone in your position of power to always tell the truth?
I think it's absolutely vital. And
Prime Minister faced questions on trust.
How important is it for someone in your position of power to always tell the truth?
I think it's absolutely vital.
If you missed it, that was the BBC cutting out the laughter from the audience when Boris Johnson was asked about honesty in politics. Here's another. And another. This is Laura Kay talking about mail voting before the ballot closed, something no one is supposed to know about.
By and large, this is a red-blue punch-up, isn't it?
Well, and also there is this question now about turnout. We haven't really talked much about turnout, actually, over the campaign, but that now is coming to the sort of front and centre of people's minds.
Certainly, and the forecast is it's going to be wet and cold tomorrow. The postal votes, of course, have already arrived. The parties, they're not meant to look at it, but they do kind of get a hint. And on both sides, people are telling me that the postal votes that are in are looking pretty grim for Labour in a lot of parts of the country. And on both sides, people are telling me that the postal votes that are in are looking pretty grim for Labour in a lot of parts of the country.
Now, during the last general election, this is footage of a Tory being brushed accidentally by a Labour activist, which turned into a lie that he was punched. It was amplified by Laura Kuenssberg.
Welcome in this country. Sleeping on the floor, hospital. And you look after these people. They've devastated our country. They've absolutely devastated our country. There's nothing left.
Why is that boy sleeping on the floor?
These people have devastated our country.
Disgusting.
I pointed my hand at you, walked into it. Devastated our country.
Disgusting.
And finally, just recently, this absolute beauty.
Actually, Ken, he was a wife beater, Stanley Johnson, on record.
Okay, let me just intervene. I'm not disputing what you're saying, but just so everyone knows what this is referring to. So Stanley Johnson's wife spoke to a journalist, Tom Bauer, and she said that Stanley Johnson had broken her nose and she had ended up in hospital as a result. Stanley Johnson has not commented publicly on that. Friends of his have said it did happen. It was a one-off.
Yes, but it did happen.
Yes, that was Fiona Bruce downplaying Stanley Johnson's domestic abuse on Question Time. The BBC at this point is pretty much a net harm to the debate, just as bad as the rest of the corporate media. That includes GB News. Now, speaking of the media in its totality, the discourse has been around Gary Lineker and the BBC rather than the bill itself. So here's a brief of the legislation. The illegal migration bill intends to outlaw asylum claims by all people arriving illegally. The plans would then transfer those people elsewhere, such as Rwanda. It aims to stop thousands of refugees from crossing the channel on small boats. The UNHCR released a statement. The legislation, if passed, would amount to an asylum ban, extinguishing the right to seek refuge protection in the United Kingdom for those who arrive irregularly, no matter how genuine and compelling their claim may be, and with no consideration of their individual circumstances. Most people fleeing war and persecution are simply unable to access the required passports and visas. There are no safe and legal routes available to them. Deny them access to asylum on this basis undermines the very purpose for which the Refugee Convention was established. So whilst the media treat this issue as a game, it's important to understand that regardless of what happens to Gary Lineker or anyone else calling the government out, one thing is for certain: refugees are set to lose.